You know them, you've heard about them, but you probably still can't find them on a map. I'm talking about Iran, but a lot of what you've heard is not quite right. So sit back, relax, we need to destroy some myths. This is 10 things to know about Iran. Let's kick it. Thanks for watching No King But Christ. I'm Adam Graham. With conflicts in Syria winding down, tensions with Russia easing, and North Korea seemingly pursuing peace with their southern brethren for the first time in years, one would hope that America might see an opportunity to bow out gracefully and give some much-needed focus to domestic concerns. But sure enough, the reneging on the JCPOA Iran nuclear deal, along with the revolving door of the State Department bringing a number of Iran hawks into higher-ranking positions, has inevitably led to a renewed focus on Iran. Now, I know that many of you may not know much about Iran or the sordid history of U.S.-Iran relations, so I set out to put some important points together to help you learn just that. Human rights and Jewish relations. In light of the sheer amount of anti-Iranian statements being made lately in the political sphere, it can be very difficult to understand exactly what Iran is actually like. So most of the oft-repeated slights against Iran's character do not touch on the actual conditions or makeup of the population there. One such statement, loosely based on Iranian anti-Israel sentiment, is that Iran is anti-Jewish or otherwise seeks to eradicate Jews. So you might be surprised to know, for instance, that Iran has a sizable Jewish community, 25,000 or so, which is actually the largest in the Middle East outside of Israel. Now, given Iran's theocratic leanings, the Jewish minority, like other non-Muslim minorities, lacks some level of representation in army and government positions. But they do have an elected representative in the Iranian parliament. They are free to worship in synagogues and can travel freely even to Israel. And despite some programs and campaigns meant to encourage Jews in Iran to immigrate to Israel, very few historically have. Many human rights objections levied against Iran also center on women's rights. Now, often, the requirement for women to wear the hijab is mentioned. It should be noted that the hijab is a scarf-like head covering, not the full-length black outfits that many may envision from pictures of women in other Middle Eastern countries, with even more restrictive laws. Now, obviously, the notion that a state should impose a dress code of sorts as a rule is repugnant to a Western democrat, but there is good news in this area. The current Iranian leadership, Prime Minister Rouhani, as well as the Ayatollah, support softening of restrictions on the hijab, and in Tehran, the police have even gone so far as to no longer arrest women for failing to adhere to the dress code. There have also been protests recently against such rules. This momentum shows a slow and steady native reaction against current norms. Now, there are some other positives for women in Iran with regards to equal rights, such as very high primary school enrollment rates and comparative rights between men and women that have been reported to outpace other Middle Eastern countries like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and even Syria and Turkey. They are allowed to drive personal vehicles, even professionally, and hold public office. Now, this is not to imply that Iran should be held in high regards for human rights in general. But the question that should be asked is, given the above facts and positive differentiators over other problematic countries, as well as the direction that progress seems to be heading on its own there, why constantly malign Iran for human rights abuses in the same breath as those calling for war or economic sanctions or regime change? Now, surely, women enjoying relative freedom in an Islamic society is preferable to thousands of dead women. Now, surely brave women and men who strive toward equal rights against their own government and their own peers is more effective than the mere empty criticisms of foreigners. The Mossadegh coup. For over a year now after the 2016 U.S. election, rumors and accusations of Russian interference in the election have been constantly on and off of the news cycle. The notion that a foreign entity could or would subvert the otherwise democratic U.S. election process has motivated Americans to outrage and threats of violence against our old Cold War rival. But what if I told you that the United States has experience with this same activity? In fact, it has not only subverted elections, but it has actively overthrown the democratically elected leaders of other countries. This is exactly the case with Iran. Prior to the 1950s, throughout the world wars and the prevalence of British colonialism throughout much of the Middle East, Britain possessed a corrupt contractual claim to Iranian oil. But in 1951, Iran elected one Mohammad Mossadegh. He was highly popular among Iranians, and nationalism was sweeping the land in much the same way as it had in other nearby countries after the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Now, that nationalism ultimately brought Mossadegh to his plan to nationalize the nation's oil reserves and drive out the British foreign presence and control. Naturally, Britain was not in favor of this plan and began to seek American assistance in seeing Mossadegh replaced. President Eisenhower, motivated by lies of Mossadegh being a communist and playing to early Cold War anti-communist sentiments, approved the CIA to secretly subvert Mossadegh. That coup was ultimately successful, installing the Iranian monarch Mohammad Reza Shah and domestic leader of the coup, a retired general, Fazlollah Zahedi, as prime minister. Now, how is that for interfering with an election? Iranian Revolution. A proper understanding of the Iranian coup of 1953 is necessary to understand the landscape of the Iranian Revolution of 1979. With a U.S.-friendly Shah successfully installed as ruler of Iran, arms sales to Iran skyrocketed to the tune of billions of dollars. For much of the 60s and 70s, the U.S. viewed Iran as its friendly bastion of stability against communism in the Middle East. Indeed, by 1978, the U.S. even agreed to provide Iran with nuclear reactors, a fact that should lend a hypocritical air to more current statements regarding Iran's possible nuclear capabilities. But while the U.S. was enjoying unprecedented influence and economic benefits from the regime, the Iranian populace found itself in a very similar situation as before, one in which a foreign power sought to use them to their own advantage, working through a political lackey beholden to contrary interests. The Shah, plagued by a history of corruption, was faced with mounting protests by 1978, and after responding both with concessions and crackdowns, fled the country. Now, those opposed to the Shah organized themselves around Ruhollah Khomeini, and he soon assumed power. This frustration also set the stage for the Iran hostage crisis. Many Iranians had seen their popular leader overthrown once, and they did not wish to repeat it. That fall, the Carter administration permitted the deposed Shah to enter the U.S. for medical treatment, and this gesture was interpreted by some Iranians as an indication that a coup was afoot once again. Iranian students overran the U.S. embassy in Tehran and held the staff hostage for 444 days. This was done without government provocation by Khomeini, though he eventually supported their actions. But perhaps the most tragic side effect of this political fallout was the decision soon after by President Carter to look for locations for the establishment of other U.S. bases in and around the Persian Gulf. As if the U.S. was not already sufficiently present in one way or another in the region, the establishment of yet greater presence and power has had devastating consequences to this day. Iran-Iraq War. Many Americans are familiar with, and indeed many have lived through, the Gulf War of the early 90s. However, just as many will be unfamiliar with the very first Gulf War, that between Iran and Iraq, waged for 8 years from 1980 to 1988. It may seem impossible to millennials, but Hussein, while playing the role of modern Hitler during the early 2000s, played the role of Stalin prior to the 90s. Following the Iranian Revolution of 1979, then ruler of Iraq, Saddam Hussein, saw Iran as vulnerable. With this in mind, he invaded Iran with the purpose of grabbing oil-rich land along the Iraqi-Iranian border. Initially obtaining his goals, he was soon opposed by the more fiercely nationalistic Iranian forces. Though the U.S. at first feigned neutrality under Jimmy Carter, by 1982, with Iraq having been pushed out of Iranian territory and Iran poised to gain a more prominent regional position, Ronald Reagan was to ally the U.S. to Saddam. Iraq, who had previously held a spot on the state sponsor of terror list, was quietly removed, and diplomatic relations were slowly fostered. The U.S. officially followed a policy of preventing Iranian influence, and engaged in a confused arms race, allowing non-US arms dealers to supply Iraq while publicly preventing arms from being sold to Iran and secretly allowing Israel, of all nations, to supply Iran with arms, effectively allowing both sides to continue their war effort far longer than would otherwise be possible. The ins and outs of the conflict are too numerous to list here, but suffice it to say that the US strategy and folly during the Iran-Iraq War set the stage for Cold War and terror war tensions against Iran that still reverberate into the present day. Hezbollah and the Beirut bombing. There is often much mention of, along with demonization of, Iran in association with Hezbollah. Hezbollah was initially formed during the summer of 1982, following the Israeli invasion and occupation of southern Lebanon. Lebanon was a notable exception to other more chaotic regions of the Middle East, despite its quite diverse population of both Shia and Sunni Muslims, along with Christians and Druze. Lebanon had not been wrecked by the sectarian struggles between its Muslim sects like other regions. That all began to change as the conflict between the Lebanese and Israelis grew to include Syria and the US and continued to devolve into a civil war, one in which the US was eventually party to. On October 23, 1983, a suicide bomber drove into the makeshift US Marine barracks in Beirut and detonated the explosives it was laden with, killing 241 US military personnel and wounding another 100. Hezbollah assumed responsibility. They went on to carry out 36 suicide terrorist attacks against American, French, and Israeli political and military targets within Lebanon through 1986. After the withdrawal of Israeli forces from Lebanon, Hezbollah primarily shifted to a defensive role for southern Lebanon, but the damage to their reputation and their legacy was done. Regardless of the nature of Hezbollah's past terrorist acts or targets, the more relevant question is to what extent Iran bears responsibility for those actions, if any at all. Iran's camaraderie with southern Lebanon makes sense, given their common Shia heritage, but Robert Pape attributes little credit to Iran's support of Lebanese resistance fighters during the occupation to the rise of Hezbollah, stating that the rise of Hezbollah and large popular support for the movement were directly caused by Israel's massive occupation of southern Lebanon in 1982, not by some outside encouragement. Iran has continued to support, in some measure, groups like Hezbollah, which has become a democratic majority within the Lebanese parliament. But to vaguely claim that Hezbollah represents a modern terrorist threat and that Iran is complicit by extension, which often seems to be the implication being made, is spurious at best. Khobar Towers bombing. During the Second Gulf War of the early 90s, the US found itself in the awkward position of opposing Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. Afterwards, the US retained a military presence in the region under the auspices of providing support and protection to the Kurdish and Shiite populations of Iraq. To do this, with Iran obviously not providing a hospitable environment from which to base their activities, they turned to Saudi Arabia. Dubbed Operation Southern Watch, the U.S. flew thousands of sorties from Saudi territory, and the U.S. presence there did not go unnoticed or unopposed. In June of 1996, terrorists executed a bombing of the Khobar Towers apartment complex in Dhahran, Saudi Arabia, killing 19 and wounding several hundred others. The complex had been used to house U.S. personnel that were supporting Operation Southern Watch. With a characteristic quickness that persists to this day, both U.S. and Saudi officials used none other than Iran as their scapegoat of choice for responsibility for the attack. A number of suspicious and fraudulent steps taken by Saudi Arabia at the time ensured that the official line of Iranian blame was upheld. But within a short few years, a substantial body of evidence showed that al-Qaeda was indeed to blame. So continued the trend of villainizing Iran at the expense of truth. More Iranian scapegoating. In May of 1987, during the heat of the Iran-Iraq War, the U.S. remained loyal to Saddam Hussein and tensions remained high in the Persian Gulf. Against this backdrop, high-profile mistakes were made. One includes the attack of the USS Stark. During a nighttime test, an Iraqi fighter pilot mistook the American ship as an Iranian one and hit it with 2 Exocet missiles. Despite the massive damage and constant fires, it was not sunk, but 37 American sailors died and 21 were injured. But though Hussein immediately took ownership of the action, claiming the ship was found in the Iraqi exclusion zone and personally sent letters and gifts of apology, the Reagan administration took the opportunity to, instead, attribute blame to Iran, calling them the real villain and a basic Iranian threat to the free flow of oil and to the principle of freedom of navigation. Another incident quickly followed in July of 1988 with the shooting down of Iran Air Flight 655 by the USS Vincennes, killing all 290 passengers and crew aboard. Washington claimed that Captain Will Rogers III acted in defense of his ship in international waters, that the plane, identified as an Iranian F-14, was flying outside of commercial airspace and descending in an attack profile. But in fact, none of this was true. The USS Vincennes was inside Iranian waters. The airline was within its assigned and legal flight path and was actually gaining altitude at the time. But instead of admitting mistake, Washington avoided responsibility, in fact claiming that Iran must bear principal responsibility for the tragedy. In the words of then Vice President George H.W. Bush, "I will never apologize for the United States. I don't care what the facts are. I'm not an apologize for America kind of guy." Nuclear program. With the recent bombshell press conference from Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli Prime Minister, claiming to have loads of evidence of secret Iranian nuclear weapons development, the Iranian nuclear question has again been thrust into the national spotlight. The obsession with Iranian nuclear capability actually goes back to decades past, nearing the end of the Cold War. With U.S.-Iranian relations souring after the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the Soviet Union's influence waning, Iran no longer held the promise of an allied bulwark against Soviet influence in the Middle East. And with Iranian backing of Shia groups in Palestine and Lebanon that opposed Israeli expansion, along with their own anti-Israeli comments and sentiments, Iran has long been a target of Israeli demonization. Iran has been a year away from possessing a nuclear weapon for decades now. But unfortunately for Iran hawks, the evidence for and threat of Iranian nuclear weapons capability has long been suspect at best. Iran's association with chemical weapons, or WMDs, in general dates back to the Iran-Iraq War when Saddam Hussein had begun using them against Iranian targets, both military and civilian. The Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps then petitioned the Ayatollah multiple times to be allowed to develop chemical, biological, and even nuclear weapons to act as a deterrent and possible retaliatory measure. But the supreme ruler denied them, claiming that such weapons are not allowed by Islam. Whether other Islamic scholars would disagree with this conclusion is possible but irrelevant. The Ayatollah is charged with being the legal and spiritual leader of Iran, and he had spoken. As it relates to the recent JCPOA deal with Iran, misinformation continues to be used and spread. At least some of the intelligence claimed by Netanyahu to show secret Iranian nuclear weapons development comes by way of the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, an anti-Iranian communist group that has a history of working with Israel to provide covert intelligence. To say that evidence of this sort may be suspect is an understatement. Furthermore, the IAEA, the international body responsible for conducting nuclear inspections and certifications, has found Iran to be in compliance with the deal and meeting its commitments fully multiple times. Regardless of how one views the merits or flaws of the JCPOA, or whether it should exist, the conclusion that Iran is free or inclined, now or in the past, to developing nuclear weapons is unwarranted. Yemen. In a high-profile press conference a few months ago, current UN Ambassador Nikki Haley claimed to show evidence of an Iranian missile used by Houthi rebels in the ongoing conflict between Yemen and Saudi Arabia. Claims that Iran is allied with and actively supports the Houthis in Yemen have long been circulated. And with those claims, along with the U.S. alliance with Saudi Arabia, the power allied against the Houthis, the presumption and implication is that, naturally, Iran and the Houthis by extension are on the wrong side of a nasty war. But is this presumption warranted? The struggle in Yemen has been characterized by a few notable figures and groups fighting for dominance and power, namely that of Ali Abdullah Saleh, originally opposed by the Houthis, and Abd Rabbu Mansur Hadi. In 2011, then-ruler Saleh was replaced by Hadi in a deal brokered with Saudi Arabia. But in 2014, the Houthis ousted Hadi, who then fled to Saudi Arabia. This sets the stage for much of the current power struggle, with Hadi and Saudi Arabia in the Yemeni north and Saleh, killed in 2017, and the Houthis in the south. The linking of the Houthi resistance and Iran is somewhat similar in nature to that of Iran and Hezbollah, at least conceptually. The southern Yemeni Zaidi population, those whom the Houthi militias claim to protect, are nominally Shia, as Iran largely is, which loosely parallels Iran's solidarity with the Shia population of southern Lebanon. However, despite the rhetoric, there has been very little substantiated evidence of material Iranian support of the Houthis, resigned to some small arms shipments and possible advisement from Hezbollah and IRGC officers. That support pales in comparison to U.S. and Saudi support of the northern Yemeni forces, the U.S. providing mid-air refueling for Saudi bombers and even participating in the naval blockade of southern Yemen, which has caused massive starvation and disease among the civilian population. Whatever Iran's level of support for Houthis in Yemen, the U.S. has a far larger log in their own proverbial eye. Demonization, axis of evil, sponsor of terrorism, Bush. There are many blanket accusations and claims that are routinely thrown around in speeches and op-eds related to the demonization of Iran. The most prevalent and poignant of those have typically involved Iran being part of an axis of evil and the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism. The first comes from a famous 2002 speech in which then-President George W. Bush lumped Iran together with Iraq and North Korea in an axis of evil regimes. A cursory understanding of the history and nature of the three countries certainly show that they have hardly anything in common. An Islamic republic, a secular dictatorship, and a communist dictatorship, one with little evidence of even pursuing weapons of mass destruction, with no demonstrable similarities in goals or alliance. And yet the label has stuck and has lasting consequences, especially in the case of North Korea, which was actually in the middle of negotiations with the US and South Korea to curtail its nuclear weapons program. Those negotiations failed soon after. In every respect, the idea that Iran represents a leading state sponsor of terrorism in the world, past or present, is preposterous. The closest one might come is the association of Iran with Hezbollah and their terrorism campaigns of the 80s, though even that is 30 years in the past. Historically, it has been Sunni Muslim groups, not Shia, as Iran's population primarily is, that constitute the vast majority of terrorist attacks and deaths. Recent terrorism reports show that ISIL, Boko Haram, the Taliban, and Al-Qaeda constitute the top terrorist threats and make up some 74% of all deaths from terrorism. All of these groups are Sunni groups, none of which are supported by Iran. In fact, it is longtime U.S. and Israeli ally Saudi Arabia which has provided the most support for fundamentalist Islam and its associated terror activities, past and present. I sincerely hope that this information has helped to clarify your understanding of the character of Iran and its recent history, as well as clearing the air of much of the misinformation that pervades the current political climate. And be sure to like and share this video and let us know in the comments below if any of these facts change your mind. And don't forget to subscribe to and follow No King But Christ to make sure you never miss a video. Okay, that was a lot of myths to bust at once. I think we're going to need some coffee now. Thanks for watching.